To talk about um, beveling tapered strips of leather. So, these tapered strips of leather are a little different to, to bevel. This is a tool. Normally, you don't use carpet blades. These are real dangerous because they have a whole sharp edge here. You have to be super careful with them. But they cut very cleanly and easily. And this is veg tan leather. Um, and when you have a certain size gap, I typically will start until it gets to the point where the rail engages or the fence engages, and I'll freehand this until the rail engages. When the rail is about to engage, and now the fence is touching it. And you'll notice that the strip coming off doesn't have the gold color, and you want to be cutting. This is a 30-degree bevel, and as the strip starts to catch the skin side of the leather, this is not locked, and hitting this wheel will widen this gap and allow you to peel. And so by hitting that wheel in this direction, it moves the fence away from the blade, increasing the gap size. And when you're doing a tapered strip, you're constantly having to stair step it up to match the width of the leather. And just like when you cut a tapered strip, you have to widen it or narrow it as you go. You have to stair step it. And then you can see how it's beveled. And again, you can do this with a much safer blade than this. And then now we're going to tighten the fence as we go because we're going the other way from wide to thin. To make a smooth taper while beveling. It's a bit tricky, but take your time and move the wheel as you need to. Now you can freehand this as well against this tool, but it's more consistent to use the fence to keep the taper and the bevel going. And for the last 18 inches or so, I'm gonna freehand the last 18 inches because it gets narrower smoothly. You can see. Then you can turn it around and do the same basic thing on the entire pair of feathers. I'm going to move the blade up because it's starting to sing. I'm freehanding it until it gets in contact with the fence. Now it's in contact with the fence. And I need to bump the fence wider. So move the fence in a little bit each time I need to as I'm tapering the strip more or beveling it at the taper. And you can tell when you need to because this piece is not right meeting the flesh side or the top side of the leather. This is how I go about beveling tapered strips. You'll notice I've got my finger against this tool and I'm providing friction and keeping the lace even and under tension, but I can't pull my thumb into the blade because of my hand shape. And that came from negative experiences of running my finger through the blade until I figured out a hand shape I could use. I still occasionally run into the open side of this blade. I'm just going to freehand the last 10 inches or 12 inches here. So you can see it beveled, a smooth line. So both sides are now beveled on this strip. So grabbing another strip, I'm going to bump the blade up a 1/16 of an inch, not much. One nice thing with these are like 3-inch blades or 3.5-inch blades. You can move them an 1/8 inch or a 1/16 of an inch up. I've put a Sharpie so you can see what I've used of this blade so far. And you run into this top knot. If you drag it through, get through the gap. And freehand this until it meets the fence, for better or worse. like I said, you can freehand these strips all day, but you can get a more consistent result if you engage the fence once you are going along. On this particular tool, this tool is by a company that's sold by Y-Knot. It's a combination beveler. When you rotate or pull on this wheel back here, it opens the, it moves this fence that way, away from the blade. And what I'm watching is where the the blade is cutting on the bottom side, so I can tell where it's engaging, how far down it is, and I don't want it taking off the top side of the leather hardly at all. As soon as it starts cutting it all the way through all the layers of the leather, I'm backing it off just a hair. This is veg tan cowhide. I've got this bleed knotted together, or square knotted together, and when you're braiding, you can lay these out on the above where you're going to cut off and braid on down, and then you can tack everything together and cut it off, so the knots won't ever be at the end of the whip. You'll have a build up there, but it's one way to make tapered whips. And so this strip is a certain width for about 9 inches. Now to make it narrower, because it's about to get narrower, you rotate that wheel in the other direction. And if the wheel won't rotate it, it's not ready. It's already kind of squished up against the blade. But as soon as it leaves the flesh side just a hair, you can tighten that wheel up to bevel a tapered shape. You don't have to do it this way. I'm kind of a crazy perfectionist. I like everything to be as smooth and perfect as I can, and beveling the flesh side lays better when you're braiding. And you'll see it goes from wide to narrow, and I'll back it up a little bit, tighten it up a little bit, and let it do a better job trimming. You can pull on this to help it engage, and then the last 18 inches or so I'll just freehand, because it's nice to have a gap behind the blade to feed it in. I used to freehand these with a credit card and a razor blade, but I've been experimenting with other things I can do with this tool. I'll freehand the first foot or so, or until that fence re-engages the strand. Now it's engaged this fence, I can open the fence a hair. And I find I can get a more perfect kind of 30-degree bevel on a tapered strip using this tool than doing it completely freehand. And more importantly, I don't fall down because I trip over something walking backwards. It's a problem with being a bit of a klutz. And I'm just leaving these strands in the scrap bucket for all the offcut, just because it's better than having dog hair end up in it from the pup. Pull on the fence and move it. Pull on the fence and tighten it. You'll figure out some hand shapes that work better to not run into the blade if you sit and play with it. Of course, like all things, most wisdom comes from bad experiences, and I've run into these blades multiple times. Doesn't matter what kind of a blade I put on here, I always seem to catch myself with it at some point. But the goal is to not do that. And I've got 64 of these feathers to make. They're double feathers. Been working on it for a day now, just getting to this point. So there's another feather done. Put another one in the bucket down here. I normally have my bright LED lights on when I'm doing this, but the cell phone camera catches a flicker off of them. Open the fence a little bit. When it starts cutting a little bit thick, I'll kick the fence back. So every 5 inches or so, the taper changes and becomes wider as you go towards the wider part. I really don't want to change the taper on these. I just want to bevel the backside so they lay nicely. I'm closing the fence towards the blade again. You can see the offcut is chattering up and down. Part of that is the blade is getting dull. And I'm going to have to move the blade up. But I can probably finish this strand out without moving the blade. A lot of knowing when to move the blade or change blades or sharpen a blade has to do with the sound it's making. And I'm just going to freehand the rest of this. Alrighty. Bump the blade up a touch. Most of the mistakes you make where you find the blade is you'll figure out pretty quick have to do with your ability to stay focused on what you're doing. And everybody's focus will wander, just whether it takes 10 minutes or 2 hours before it really starts wandering. Okay, I'm running on the fence now on the other side. The fence knows better how to maintain the width than I can freehanding it and eyeballing it. It takes less concentration, allows me to do it, work on something longer, which hopefully keeps me from cutting myself. And I started to catch the underside, but the top skin, there's maybe a 100th of a millimeter. That's how close I am to cutting into the top of the skin with this. And also how consistently the feathers actually cut, which is the rather impressive part. Is that it's that consistent that even when using the fence, you can tell that the width is super consistent. So right here it narrows down. So I'm going to narrow it. See it change. Narrow it. Narrow it. Narrow it. Narrow it. People ask me for tips and tricks on stuff. So I'm trying to show more of processes and how I go about doing some of the crazy things I do. But beveling tapered strips can be done with a fixed tool like this, or it can be done freehand. It's faster to do it freehand, but easier for things to go wrong and ruin the taper that you spent the time setting in the beginning. Freehand the last 1.5 feet here. I guess it was more like, yeah, about 18 inches. So now that's a double. It's tapered on, it's beveled on both sides, but you can see the consistency of that bevel if I don't walk my hand into open blade. You can see how consistent that is on both sides, or get some idea. Okay, that one's done. And it's more challenging to do this on tapered strips than it is to do it on a straight strip, but gives you some idea. So this is veg tan cowhide going from about 1/8 of an inch wide all the way up to 1/2 an inch over about 5 feet, 5.5 feet, maybe 6 feet, depending on how which set of feathers I was doing. Hitting the fence. This is a much more dynamic process than beveling straight lace, because these are tapered strips. But I have to narrow the fence every 4 or 5 inches that I pull through, because the taper is constantly changing and going down. There's lots of ways to do things. I'm just showing you how I go about doing this, my latest thing. Let's move the blade again. Alrighty. Yeah, running into a carpet blade will ruin your day. There. One of the things you'll notice is I don't have this top piece, this fence, locked down. The reason I don't have it locked down is I would have to rotate my hand in front of this blade to lock it, and you're going to cut yourself. And when I say you are, I mean for sure you will cut yourself, because it's not a smart thing to use this blade, except that it cuts cleaner than a schick blade does for this particular process. and it cuts cleaner for chrome tanned if you're going to try and bevel chrome tanned or latigo. Or resize stuff. I'm closing the gap on the fence now. So I'm pushing it the other direction as it tapers down instead of tapering up. Let's see. In that case, I ran out of. I pulled it too far. I'm going to freehand the rest of this. Another tapered strip. Move the blade up just a touch. Freehanding it until the rail makes contact. A lot of this is an art form more than a science, but you still try and get it within. I'm always striving to be accurate with stuff to a thousandth of an inch. And leather is not a material that, in steel you can pull that off, but it's really, really hard to be super accurate with leather because it shifts around and moves, and every time you think you're getting there to where you're going to get something to work perfectly, you discover that you don't know as much as you think you do, and that it's going to fight you in different ways. And these will have to be rebeveled on the fly to match the taper of the core, but it's good to be within the tolerances that you want to start with if you can get there. Okay. And again, there's 8-9 inches, and the taper changes. There's two sections that are 9 inches that are pretty identical, and then it goes down to 6 inches, and then it goes down to 4 inches, where I kicked it over when I was cutting the strips. Not using this tool to cut the strips, but I'm freehanding this. You see, I polished the skin on my fingers just today doing this. Once I get to where the fence engages, which causes friction as you're going through it, you open up the fence a little bit and use it as a guide. I'm not trying to reduce change the taper of the material. I'm just beveling a consistent 30-degree angle off of a tapered strip here, or as consistently as I can. The top side of this is gold, and there is no gold on the strip coming off, which is a good gauge on how close you're cutting your triangle. I'm tightening up the fence to be consistent with the bevel, with the taper. And it goes a little bit faster if I'm not talking and shooting this on YouTube. It just, some of you crafters out there might be interested in beveling tapered strips because you're building a whip or covering a tapered object with a fixed number of strips. This is one way to go about doing that. I'm just going to freehand the last of this. So you can see how the bevel stays consistent on the bottom side. You get a good result using this method, which is why I'm taking the time to do this. I spent all day yesterday cutting the tapered strips and putting them together. Got a little bit more room. I can go up, and then I'm going to have to flip this blade. The Sharpie, if you take a Sharpie and paint your blade, then you can tell where you've used the blade because it wears the Sharpie away. Okay, I've engaged the fence because the width is where the fence is set. I'm going to open the fence a little bit. And what my eyes are doing is they're tracking how close to the top side I'm cutting, making sure I'm not cutting into the type side. So every 3 or 4 inches, because the strip keeps getting wider as I'm moving towards the bleed knot. It gets wider and wider from like 1/8 of an inch to 1/2 an inch, which is significant, but you wouldn't think a smooth taper would be that hard to, that little difference from 1/8 to 1/2. Would be that hard to go through and do this with, but to be consistent with it, it's more difficult than you might think. See, in this area here, still no golden top side, which is good. I have to open it up one last time because this last 9 or 10 inches is consistent. And then work the blade out without catching my fingers. Then work leather strip in without catching my fingers or cutting through. Sometimes that's the hardest part with this, which sounds crazy, but it's not as crazy as all that. Now I'm going to make it tighter. I don't really recommend using this blade. It's going to bite you at some point, but it works. And it's what I have. It's going through too many single edge blades. I'm going to freehand the last 18 inches. I guess more like for the last 2 feet. The nice part, if you have it tapered to nothing, is you can slide it behind and save a whole lot of time dealing with adjusting the fence and going between the blade and the fence. I'm walking this lace over to meet the fence so that when I get to the fence, I've reached the wider part that's engaging the fence, and you'll get friction as soon as it engages on both sides, and then you open it a little bit. And you can feel it catch. You can go by that as well. But visually, you're watching for the white line of the top surface of the skin, which is gold here, engaging the blade as it cuts through. It's right at the edge. Give it a little bit more. That's about the 9 inches where I bumped it down in the other direction. Now you're going to tighten the fence by pushing it up that way. It happens every 4 to 6 inches from this point on. I'm also holding it as though I'm going to freehand the whole thing in case it comes out from contacting the fence. Freehand the last of this. You're basically watching this worm come off and trying to keep it consistent. You can see how consistent as that goes up, how well it's beveled at 30 degrees underneath. No gotchas, no. And then as it goes back down, see the width. And then these strips will be re-beveled in place if necessary, if the tapered doesn't perfectly match the application. But it's time for a break. Come back and watch me if I get a chance to stop it.